The morning mist clung heavily to the frozen ground of the Pratzen Heights on December 2nd, 1805. A silence hung over the rolling hills of the Moravian countryside, a deception that masked the presence of nearly 160,000 soldiers waiting for the signal to unleash hell. In the cold, damp air, thousands of French infantrymen lay flat on their stomachs, hidden within the depressions of the terrain and the thick fog that blanketed the valley floor. Their breath formed small white clouds as they gripped their muskets with freezing hands, waiting for the command from the emperor. Above them, the sun began to pierce through the gray veil, illuminating the gold eagles atop their regimental standards. This was not merely a battle, it was a trap set by a military genius. Across the valley, the combined forces of the Russian and Austrian empires believed they had the advantage. They looked down from the high ground, seeing only a weak French right flank that seemed ripe for crushing. The Allied commanders, confident in their superior numbers and position, began to move their massive columns down the slopes, abandoning the strategic heights to encircle the perceived weak point of the French line. The sound of thousands of boots marching in unison and the clattering of caissons on the frozen earth echoed through the valley. They marched with the arrogance of old-world aristocrats, fighting a war they thought they understood. They did not realize they were walking directly into the jaws of a modern war machine designed to exploit exactly this kind of mistake. The tension in the French lines was palpable as the enemy descended like a slow-moving avalanche. Every soldier, from the lowest private to the highest marshal, knew that the fate of France hung in the balance on this cold winter morning. If the line broke, the Grand Army would be crushed, and the revolution it defended would be extinguished by the monarchies of Europe. The ground trembled as the Allied artillery began to find its range, sending cannonballs plowing through the frost and earth. Yet the French center remained motionless, a coiled spring waiting for the precise moment when the tension would be too great to hold back. The discipline required to stand fast while an army twice your size advances upon you is the hallmark of veteran troops. Suddenly, the signal came not with a roar, but with a calculated unleashing of the hidden reserve. Marshal Soult and his 4th Corps emerged from the fog like ghosts, ascending the Pratzen Heights that the Allies had just foolishly abandoned. The surprise was total and absolute. The sun finally broke through the mist completely, casting a brilliant light on the blue coats of the French infantry as they stormed the plateau. The Lion of the Valley had jumped to the mountain top. The panic that ensued in the Allied rear was immediate and catastrophic. The hunters had become the prey in a matter of minutes, and the strategic masterstroke of the Emperor was revealed in real time. The center of the Allied army was pierced, and their forces were cut in two. Chaos erupted as the French infantry poured volley after volley into the exposed flanks of the Russian columns. The trap had snapped shut with brutal efficiency, turning the snowy fields of Austerlitz into a slaughterhouse. Men who had marched with dreams of glory now scrambled for survival on the ice-covered ponds that lay at the bottom of the valley. The roar of the French cannons, specifically positioned to shatter the ice, sent hundreds of retreating soldiers plunging into the freezing water. This victory was not just about courage or strength, it was about the mind of one man and the instrument he had forged. The Battle of Austerlitz would go down in history as the masterpiece of tactical deception and the ultimate validation of a new kind of warfare. The stakes of this conflict extended far beyond the bloody fields of Moravia. Europe was in the throes of a massive transformation, where the old feudal order was clashing violently with the new ideals of the French Revolution. The monarchies of Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia viewed the rise of France not just as a territorial threat, but as an existential plague that challenged the divine right of kings. They formed coalition after coalition, pouring millions of pounds of gold and hundreds of thousands of men into the effort to contain the French contagion. If France fell, the clock would be turned back, and the rights of man would be buried under the boot of the old aristocracy. For the French people, the war was a struggle for survival and identity. The memory of the invasion of 1792 remained fresh in the collective consciousness, a time when foreign armies had marched on Paris to restore the Bourbon monarchy. The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte offered a shield against this return to the past. He represented the stability of the state and the glory of the nation combined into one figure. However, the cost of this security was a state of perpetual war. The Grand Army was the only wall standing between the radical changes of the Revolution and the vengeful armies of the conservative powers. Defeat meant the dismantling of everything the French had bled for over the previous decade. The sheer scale of the conflict required a mobilization of resources never before seen in human history. War was no longer the sport of kings fought by small professional armies over limited objectives. It had become a clash of nations involving the entire population and the full economic might of the state. The logistical demands of feeding, clothing, and arming hundreds of thousands of men across a continent were staggering. A single campaign could bankrupt a nation or decimate a generation of young men. The leaders of Europe were playing a high-stakes game of poker with human lives as the chips and the future of Western civilization as the pot. At the center of this whirlwind stood a man who would define the era. Napoleon Bonaparte was more than a general, he was a force of nature who reorganized the art of war from the ground up. His mind worked like a complex clockwork mechanism, capable of processing vast amounts of information and translating it into decisive action. He possessed a memory for detail that allowed him to know the location of individual regiments and the number of cannons in a specific battery hundreds of miles away. He was a workaholic who slept little and demanded absolute perfection from his subordinates. His ambition was boundless, but it was matched by an intellect that frightened his enemies as much as his armies did. Napoleon realized early on that the old methods of warfare were obsolete. The rigid linear tactics of the 18th century, where armies marched in slow columns and fought in polite lines, were too slow and predictable. He envisioned a fluid, dynamic form of warfare, where speed and maneuver were more important than brute force. He wanted an army that could move faster than the news of its arrival, striking the enemy before they even knew they were in danger. To achieve this, he needed to completely restructure the French military system. He needed to create an organism that could think and act independently while remaining under his ultimate control. To execute his grand vision, Napoleon relied on a trusted circle of marshals and his indispensable chief of staff, Louis Alexander Berthier. Berthier was the shadow behind the emperor, the man who translated the terse verbal commands of Napoleon into detailed written orders that moved corps across the map of Europe. While Napoleon was the creative genius, Berthier was the operational brain, ensuring that the complex machinery of the Grand Army functioned without seizing up. The relationship between these two men was the cornerstone of French command, allowing for a level of coordination that the coalition armies could not hope to match. The fundamental question facing Napoleon was how to control such a massive force over such vast distances. How does one man command 200,000 soldiers spread out over a front of 100 miles without losing cohesion? The answer lay in the creation of the Corps d'Armée system. Before Napoleon, armies were typically unitary blocks that moved as a single slow mass. Napoleon broke his army into self-contained mini-armies called corps. Each corps consisted of 20,000 to 30,000 men and possessed its own infantry, cavalry, artillery, and engineers. This structure was revolutionary. Each corps was commanded by a marshal capable of independent action. A single corps was strong enough to hold off a much larger enemy force for at least a day, allowing the other corps to converge on the sound of the guns. This allowed the Grand Army to move in a dispersed formation, covering a wide net of territory to forage for food, while retaining the ability to concentrate rapidly for battle. The maxim was simple: move separately, strike together. This flexibility confused the enemy commanders, who were still operating with unitary armies that moved at the pace of their slowest wagon. The result of this system was a dramatic increase in strategic speed. The Grand Army could march 30 miles a day, fighting small engagements along the way, while their enemies struggled to cover 10. This speed was not just a physical feat, it was a weapon. Napoleon used the legs of his soldiers to win battles before a single shot was fired. By outmarching his opponents, he could place his army across their lines of communication, cutting them off from their supplies and forcing them to fight on ground of his choosing. He turned the map of Europe into a chessboard where he always moved two pieces for every one of the enemy. However, a large army requires a massive amount of manpower. The professional armies of the past were limited by the number of volunteers or mercenaries a king could afford. The French Revolution changed this equation with the introduction of the levée en masse, or mass conscription. In 1793, the French government declared that all Frenchmen were permanently requisitioned for the service of the armies. This decree created the first true national army in Europe. It allowed France to field numbers that overwhelmed the smaller professional forces of their neighbors. This system of conscription was refined under Napoleon into a regular yearly draft. Every department in France was required to provide a quota of young men based on its population. This steady stream of recruits ensured that the Grand Army could absorb horrific losses and still remain a potent fighting force. It democratized war, making the defense of the nation the responsibility of every citizen. While this was unpopular in some regions, it provided a depth of manpower that the coalition powers could not match until they too adopted similar measures years later. The soldiers of the Grand Army were a mix of hardened veterans and fresh conscripts. The veterans, known as the grognards or grumblers, were the soul of the army. They had marched across the sands of Egypt and the snows of the Alps. They were fiercely loyal to the emperor, whom they saw as one of their own. They taught the new recruits the art of survival, how to find food, how to keep their muskets dry, and how to stand firm under fire. This blend of youthful enthusiasm and gritty experience created a unit cohesion that was the envy of the world. Training in the Grand Army was often done on the march. Napoleon believed that discipline and morale were more important than precision drilling. While the Prussians practiced the perfect goose step, the French practiced marching long distances with heavy packs. The emphasis was on endurance and the ability to execute complex maneuvers rapidly on the battlefield. A French column could deploy into a line of battle, fire a volley, and reform into a square to repel cavalry in a matter of minutes. This tactical flexibility gave them a distinct advantage over the rigid formations of their enemies. The logistical philosophy of the Grand Army was also a departure from tradition. Most 18th century armies were tethered to massive supply trains and magazines. They could not move far from their depots without risking starvation. Napoleon cut this tether. He ordered his troops to live off the land, requisitioning food and fodder from the local population. This allowed the army to travel light and fast, unencumbered by thousands of slow wagons. While this caused great hardship for the civilians in the path of the army, it gave the French a strategic mobility that was virtually unstoppable. Yet this system of living off the land had a significant vulnerability. It worked well in the rich agricultural lands of Italy and Germany, where food was plentiful and the population density was high. It relied on short, sharp campaigns that ended quickly. The system was never designed for long, drawn-out wars of attrition in sparsely populated regions. This limitation would eventually become the Achilles heel of the Grand Army, leading to catastrophe when the theater of war shifted to the barren plains of the East. The crowning jewel of the Grand Army was the Imperial Guard. This was an elite corps within the corps, a reserve force that answered only to Napoleon. Composed of the most experienced and decorated soldiers, the Guard received better pay, better food, and better uniforms than the line infantry. They were the ultimate shock troops, held in reserve until the critical moment of the battle. When the tall bearskin caps of the old Guard appeared through the smoke, the enemy knew that the final blow was coming. To serve in the Guard was the highest honor a French soldier could achieve. Napoleon was an artillery officer by training, and he placed a heavy emphasis on the use of cannons. He famously stated that God is on the side with the best artillery. He massed his guns into grand batteries, concentrating their fire on a single point in the enemy line to punch a hole for his infantry and cavalry. The French Gribeauval system of artillery was standardized, lighter, and more mobile than enemy cannons, allowing the French to move their guns quickly around the battlefield to support the infantry wherever they were needed most. The cavalry of the Grand Army served as the eyes and ears of the emperor. The light cavalry, the hussars and chasseurs, swarmed ahead of the army, screening its movements and gathering intelligence. The heavy cavalry, the cuirassiers and carabineers, were the hammer used to smash enemy formations. Clad in steel breastplates and helmets and riding massive horses, the heavy cavalry charges were terrifying spectacles of brute force. Led by daring commanders like Murat, the French cavalry was instrumental in turning retreats into routs. By 1812, the Grand Army had become a multinational force. It included contingents from Poland, Italy, Germany, Switzerland, and other allied states. While this swelled the numbers, it also diluted the cohesion and language uniformity of the force. The intense loyalty that the native French troops felt for Napoleon was not always shared by the conscripts from the vassal states. As the army grew larger, it became more unwieldy and harder to control. The precise instrument of Austerlitz was becoming a blunt, heavy club. The question that haunted the later years of the empire was whether this war machine could sustain itself indefinitely. The constant campaigns drained the French population of its youth. The draft dodging became more common, and the quality of the recruits began to decline. The horses of France were being exhausted at an alarming rate, and the cavalry arm began to suffer. The Grand Army was eating itself alive, consuming the very resources it needed to survive. The limits of mass conscription and maneuver warfare were about to be tested in the vast emptiness of Russia. In June 1812, Napoleon launched the invasion of Russia with the largest army Europe had ever seen. Over 600,000 men crossed the Niemen River. The objective was to force the Tsar into a decisive battle and bring him back into the continental system. But the Russians refused to play by Napoleon's rules. Instead of standing and fighting, they retreated deep into their vast territory, drawing the French further and further away from their bases of supply. The strategy of maneuver was met with a strategy of space and time. The summer heat was oppressive and the dust choked the marching columns. Before the first major battle was even fought, the Grand Army lost thousands of men to disease and exhaustion. The horses died in droves, unable to find enough grazing in the scorched earth left behind by the retreating Russians. The system of living off the land collapsed when there was no land left to live off. The logistical nightmare that Napoleon had always managed to avoid now became a reality. The supply wagons could not keep up with the advance, and the soldiers began to starve. At Borodino, the two armies finally clashed in a horrific, grinding battle of attrition. It was a slugfest devoid of the brilliant maneuvers of the past. Napoleon, suffering from a high fever, refused to commit the Imperial Guard to deliver the knockout blow. Although the French won the field, the Russian army remained intact and retreated again. The victory was hollow. The French entered Moscow hoping for a surrender, but found only a deserted city. Soon fires broke out, set by Russian saboteurs, turning the prize into a smoking ruin. Napoleon waited in the ashes of Moscow for weeks, hoping the Tsar would sue for peace. No envoy ever came. The realization slowly dawned on the emperor that he had been lured into a trap not of armies, but of geography and climate. With winter approaching and supplies running critically low, he made the fateful decision to retreat. The march back to the French border would become one of the greatest tragedies in military history. The Grand Army, which had conquered Europe, was about to be conquered by the elements. The Russian winter arrived with a vengeance. Temperatures plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. Men froze to death where they stood. The roads became lined with the frozen corpses of soldiers and horses. The discipline that had held the army together shattered. It became a mob of desperate individuals fighting for a scrap of food or a place near a fire. The Cossacks harried the flanks, cutting down stragglers without mercy. The once proud Grand Army was reduced to a column of spectral figures, wrapped in rags, shuffling through the snow. The crossing of the Berezina River was the final circle of hell. With the Russian armies closing in from three sides, French engineers worked in freezing water up to their chests to build bridges. They sacrificed their lives to allow the remnants of the army to escape. The panic on the bridges as the bridges caught fire and the Russian artillery bombarded the crossing was a scene of absolute horror. Only a fraction of the magnificent force that had crossed the Niemen in June returned. The Grand Army of 1812 had ceased to exist. The catastrophe in Russia emboldened the enemies of France. A new coalition formed, and for the first time Napoleon faced a united Europe that had learned from his methods. The Prussians and Austrians had reformed their armies, adopting the corps system and the staff structures that had made the French so formidable. They now fought with a patriotic fervor that matched the early days of the French Revolution. The advantage in quality and organization that France had enjoyed for a decade was gone. Despite the disaster, Napoleon managed to raise a new army in 1813 through sheer force of will. But this new army was young and inexperienced. It lacked the cavalry needed to scout and pursue, and it lacked the veteran non-commissioned officers to steady the ranks. The campaign of 1813 saw flashes of the old genius, but the weight of numbers was against France. At the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, Napoleon was defeated by the sheer mass of the coalition armies. The retreat continued this time all the way to the borders of France itself. The invasion of France in 1814 showed Napoleon at his tactical best. With a small army of teenagers and veterans, he darted between the invading columns, winning a series of improbable victories. But he could not be everywhere at once. The marshals were tired, the people were exhausted, and the generals were plotting treason. Paris fell and Napoleon was forced to abdicate. The Grand Army was disbanded and the Bourbons were restored to the throne. It seemed the era was over. But the story had one final twist. In 1815, Napoleon escaped from exile and returned to France. The soldiers sent to arrest him instead defected, weeping with joy at the sight of their little corporal. The Grand Army was reborn for 100 days. Veterans flocked to the Eagles and the war machine sputtered back to life. But the strategic situation was hopeless. The armies of Britain and Prussia were gathering in Belgium, and the Russians and Austrians were marching from the east. The climax came at Waterloo. On a muddy field in Belgium, Napoleon faced the Duke of Wellington. The battle was a close-run thing, a brutal contest of endurance. The French attacks were clumsy, lacking the coordination of the glory years. The British infantry stood firm behind the ridge, and the arrival of the Prussians on the French flank sealed the doom of the Emperor. The Old Guard made one last defiant advance, but they too were forced back. The Grand Army broke and fled into the night, never to be reformed. The reveal of this epic saga is found in the silence that followed the thunder of the guns. The Grand Army was destroyed, but the world it created remained. The map of Europe had been irrevocably changed. The Holy Roman Empire was gone, replaced by a German confederation that would eventually rise to challenge France. The ideals of the Napoleonic Code and the meritocratic system survived the return of the kings. The art of war had been revolutionized, and every military academy in the world would study the campaigns of the Grand Army for the next 2 centuries. The immediate aftermath was a period of reaction and repression, but the seeds of nationalism and liberalism had been planted deep in the soil of Europe. The veterans of the Grand Army returned to their villages, telling stories of distant lands and glory. They became a living legend, a reminder of a time when a common soldier could rise to become a marshal of the empire. The myth of Napoleon grew larger than the man himself, casting a long shadow over the 19th century. The human cost was staggering. Millions of men died in the Napoleonic Wars. A generation of Frenchmen lies buried from the plains of Spain to the steppes of Russia. The demographic impact on France was felt for decades. The conscription system, which had allowed France to punch above its weight, eventually bled the nation white. It was a lesson in the limits of military power and the insatiable appetite of total war. Closing thoughts turn to the legacy of the maneuver warfare pioneered by the Grand Army. The concepts of the corps system, the independent staff, and the operational art are still the bedrock of modern military doctrine. The US Army, the German Wehrmacht, and the Soviet Red Army all built their structures on the foundations laid by Napoleon and Berthier. The ability to move large forces rapidly and strike with decisive mass remains the holy grail of commanders today. Napoleon once said that glory is fleeting, but obscurity is forever. The Grand Army ensured that he would never be obscure. It was a flawed, magnificent, and terrible instrument of war. It achieved heights of military brilliance that have rarely been equaled, and it plunged Europe into a depth of suffering that had rarely been seen. It was the ultimate expression of the will of one man, amplified by the collective effort of millions. Today, the monuments to the Grand Army stand in Paris and across France. The names of the battles are etched into the stone of the Arc de Triomphe. But the true monument is the modern world itself, which was forged in the fires of those conflicts. The Grand Army marched into history, leaving behind a trail of blood and glory that still fascinates us. It teaches us about the power of organization, the fragility of empires, and the enduring nature of the human spirit in the face of impossible odds.